Okay, I don't have any notes in front of me, so let me see how I do extempore talking about this paper. You know, this our course, as I mentioned, I think early on, we're kind of taking the generally the route of what's called systematic theology. You know, kind of dealing with doctrine one after the other. This is my new, I don't know, it's pretty wild. My wife, she doesn't like all the splashy, bright colors, as you know. Okay, back to the topic. One of the goals of systematic theology is, as much as possible, that we understand our Christian faith and its teachings in some kind of cohesive and coherent vision. Granted, there will always be, little... It doesn't all always fit together smoothly, I guess what I'm going to say. There can be some little dead ends here, unanswered questions there. There's sometimes systematic theology gets criticized for being a little too sure of how everything should fit together. Nonetheless, there is a lot to be said for attempting to understand our faith in some kind of cohesive way. Thus, this paper is a little exercise in trying to do that. For quite a few years now, I've settled in on okay, what's the Christian doctrine of God? And of course, there's an awful lot of that's a big question, right? Or it's a question that demands a huge answer. But so we're taking the doctrine of God, and then the doctrine of humanity, theological anthropology, right? In fact, this paper really is sort of I'm asking you to delve into the sort of the realm of theological anthropology, meaning how do we understand what it means to be human in a way that's coherent with what we believe to be the case about the God that we pray to and worship. So, there's a lot of different angles you can take on this. Let's do a couple obvious things. One would be, and a natural, is human beings are created in God's image. Okay, well, then the right question is, well, what does that mean? And there are a host of answers to that question. I encourage you to use the things that we've read already and talked about in class. I think it wouldn't hurt you if you were to look at M. Lowdahl, The Story of God. I think I have a couple of chapters in there early on. The chapters are not long. It's not an overbearing book. But I talk about being created in God's image a bit there. So that's one angle. Another thing that must be said is anytime we're talking about what's the relationship between our doctrine of God and our doctrine of, human nature, human existence, right at the heart of both of those, I should have started here, is the person of Jesus. So another way to go at this kind of isn't this a neat rock, by the way? This has gone through the polisher. I might have brought this I think I maybe brought this to class already, but I know I'm straying now from the topic, but I found this in the ground. That blows me away. I found this in the ground, picked it up, tumbled it a while. Do you hear my tumbler in the background? You probably do. And wow. So, sorry. ADHD. Is that what I mean? I don't even know. Lowdahl. Get back to the topic. So Jesus Christ as the revelation of God, ultimate revelation of God, and also the ultimate revelation of we'll say, ideal human existence. We believe this about Jesus in our Christian faith. And in fact, one might ask, wow, to what extent are those actually deeply related? And again, in terms of human beings created in God's image, is the fact that Jesus, we believe, is the true revelation of ideal human existence. Is that alongside of being a revelation of God's, the ultimate revelation of God's character and nature? Or are these somehow more intimately related sort of revelations? There's different angles to take, though, as well. Like, rather than in the image of God, one might go with a stronger emphasis on the difference between God and human creatures. So where the categories of creator and creature are your more fundamental ones. Certainly we are creatures, we are created. We even talked today an awful lot about us being, dust. Another term that's used a lot in the Old Testament is grass for creatures. And in both cases, including humans, the idea is we're temporary. And we're fleeting, we're finite, vulnerable, frail. You can just pile on the adjectives. And so we could say in those ways, very unlike God. In fact, there was an interesting question. I'm going to call out Maggie for a very good question in her response to the theological anthropology lecture thingies. And that was to look at Genesis 1 and 2 side by side. And she's right to point to sort of see that in Genesis 1, there's a kind of really elevated view of the human, Adam, male and female, created in God's image. That's all in Genesis 1. Genesis 2 doesn't use the language of image of God. Genesis 2 is also where we can encounter the Holy One, Yahweh, saying something's not good about creation. It happens to be about the human. It is not good for the human to be alone. And the human is dredged up out of mud or clay. All the other creatures are as well. So there's kind of I would say, a lower view of the human. But these come right at the beginning of our Bible. Is there a way to kind of talk about those together? And I even mentioned to, I don't know if I have the book, I think I still have the book at school, a wonderful treatment of this by a rabbi who's now passed away, but a leading 20th century Orthodox rabbi whose last name was Soloveitchik. I can't remember what his first name was. Doesn't matter. But Soloveitchik did a wonderful book. It's actually, the title is Halakhic Man, and if you're going like, what is halakhic? It's the adjective derived from the word halakha, which is the Jewish term for law. So sort of the human being understood through the lens of Jewish law, halakhic, human. But really what he does is talks about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, puts them side by side. It says in Genesis 1 you have this sort of glorious view of the human. You'll also find that in Psalm 8, crowned with glory and honor. But then Genesis 2, this more lowly and lonely human who needs a partner that he, she, they don't have yet. And so it's a different view of the human in a lot of ways. I'm just throwing out some possibilities. You could certainly go with this in the route of the image of God as the creatures called by God to care for the rest of creation. So you can certainly take kind of an ecological direction. Also, if we talk about the human beings created in the image of God, and nobody should use the phrase image of God in human beings in your paper, because you'll drive me crazy and I'll drive your grade down. That's not biblical language. We're never told that the image of God is in us. But if we say that all human beings are created in God's image, or created to image God, another thing we'd be able to say is, just because we've been created to do that doesn't mean we're doing it. And in fact, at the heart of Christianity is, as John Wesley really appreciated, renewal in the image of God, being, at least in the process of being restored to the image of God. And Wesley picks this up a lot from the Apostle Paul. So you might look at texts in the New Testament that stress that Jesus is the image of God. I know I mentioned that in the videos, and a lot of you picked up on that, of course. And what's the relationship between that and you and I being created in the image of God? So there's a lot of directions to go. It doesn't have to be image of God stuff. It can be just creatures of dust stuff, if that's the way you'd like to go. It can be putting Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 side by side, and there you kind of get both. It could have a focus more on Christology. What does it mean to say that Jesus is the true human? Where does the New Testament use that language? Because it does. And how is it used? So there's a lot of different directions to go here. You could also take the direction of we are fallen creatures, so that whenever we talk about human beings, clearly we acknowledge that there's a great gap between the kinds of lives that we live and the kind of life that we see witnessed to in the Gospels, of the life of Jesus. And that difference is what we call sin, to put it very simply. A lot of different directions to go, and I don't think the paper is supposed to be real long. It was maybe 5-6 pages, which may seem like a lot to you. I know it might. But look at what I noticed that Fisher and Hart don't really have a chapter on human existence per se. They start with the riddle of existence, and there might be some good in there. Then they go to the doctrine of God. The doctrine of the Trinity. I'll say this real quick. And Elizabeth Conde Fraser actually talked briefly about this, maybe in her very first lecture. So what does it mean that we confess God to be triune and thus essentially social in God's own eternal character? And how does that shed light on the nature of human existence, at least sort of as the ideal human existence? It's going to be social, right? It's going to be mutually sharing. She used the term perichoresis in once, at least in her, I think her first lecture. I have this book here, Renewal in Love, that this is basically a theological anthropology, but I would say like in the first 2 chapters, if you can find a copy of this somewhere, that could be helpful. But of course it needs to be your paper, but there's nothing wrong with quoting other people, of course. Generally you should agree with what you quote, unless you're quoting somebody in order to say they're full of beans and here's why, and why my ideas are different from this and why they're better than this. So I hope that helps. I've gone plenty long on this. You can send me an email if you're still unclear. It should be a fairly open-ended assignment, except that the whole idea is to think coherently, we'll say again, about what we Christians believe about God, and what we believe, let's say, Scripture and our own experience teaches us about what it means to be human. How do we think about these two together? How much coherence, how much contrast, that kind of thing. All right? Oh my goodness, it's getting late at night, and I'm going to post this soon. Blessings.